Bienvenido a un nuevo evento de Cátedra Europa.
Good morning. On behalf of the 24th edition of Cátedra Europa, we welcome you to the conference Communication and PR in After Pandemic World, for which we have the special participation of Professor Robin Reed from EU Business School. We will now leave you with Professor Reed. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Maria. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a real honor to be invited to participate or to host this event and this particular seminar. Myself, I've been with the EU Business School as a professor in communications and human resource management for nearly 13 years now, working both in Geneva and in Montreux, where I live, and online as well. So it's an area which particularly interests me. And of course, in recent months and over the last couple of years, it's taken on a completely different dimension. I think just before we go into the dark side of the pandemic, maybe a bit of light side, because I know that many of you are based in Colombia. It's a beautiful country. It's a country I really want to visit. But I thought I'd start this presentation with a story about Sally and Harry. And Sally and Harry are very good friends of mine. I've known them since I was 3 years old, and they got married in their 20s, and they had 3 children. And the first child, James, visited Bogota to teach English, and he's never come back. He loves it so much there that he's been there now for nearly 15 years. So about 5 years ago, his elder sister visited him, and she fell in love with a Colombian, and they're now married. I'm not sure where they're living in Colombia, but they've got 2 children. And so they haven't returned to England for a while as well. And then their youngest son, Stephen, went for a family reunion of his siblings in Colombia, and he's now found a job there, and he hasn't come back. So I have 2 of my closest friends who live in a quiet rural part of Middle England who have 3 children who are all based in beautiful Colombia. So that's my main intention in life, is one of my great ambitions is to visit your lovely country. The dark side. Yeah, I mean, it's been since 2019, the world's been turned upside down with something that was totally unexpected, probably leading to the biggest disaster that the world has seen since the Second World War. We all know, every single one of us knows of somebody who directly or indirectly who suffered, not somebody, but possibly many people. And that reflects the scale of this pandemic. It's been a very invidious sort of disease, because I think all of us believed we could conquer it within maybe a year, 18 months. But we've actually had to deal with different waves arriving with different variants in different parts of the world. So where we've snapped it out in one place, it's then either come back with another variant, or it's surging in other parts of the world. So if we look at the consequences, they've been pretty dire. I mean, so far we've lost 5 million people, and we've had 240 million cases that have been reported. This is on a big scale. Of course, it's global. In terms of the economic ramifications, well, it's the worst global economic crisis since the Great Depression. And it's hit certain sectors very hard. So, you know, if we look at, for example, the hospitality industry, accommodation, food services, arts and culture, these venues have had to be confined and shut. Retail, construction, the airline business completely decimated, to name just a few. But on the other side, sometimes disasters actually evolve into positives as well. So we've seen positive job growth in a number of higher skilled services, such as IT, communications, financial and insurance services, and the pharmaceutical industry, of course. Unemployment, well, it's hit hard. 8.8% of global working hours have been lost in the fourth quarter of 2019. And that's one of the worst sets of figures since the financial crisis or meltdown in 2009. The economic downturn is actually beginning to revolve. It's beginning to change. So we are seeing upticks in various sectors which have been so seriously affected, but it's also bringing with it all sorts of logistical issues with supply chains. I mean, we're a very integrated, globalized world, and we've had all sorts of issues dealing with the economic downturn that preceded this uptick. So, for example, in South America, Brazil has had a very poor coffee harvest, and they also forecast an even worse one next year. So coffee prices have increased by 50% since January. But just to highlight the logistical problem, on the other side of the world, Vietnam, which is the second biggest, highest coffee producer in the world, has had a wonderful harvest. But their problem is actually supplying the rest of the world to take up the slack for Brazil, because they can't find the containers to ship the product out of their country. So we're coming across issues that really were just normal assumptions before COVID, that are causing all sorts of issues in problems in the automotive industry. I've spoken to various company leaders who have said their order books are full. They just can't produce, and they're waiting for spare parts. So there's a logistical issue here that's going to take time to unwind. I mean, it's not going to be a permanent problem, but there has been this knock-on effect. Obviously, beyond unemployment, we've got all sorts of psychological problems and conditions that have emerged from COVID. This includes this has really affected some of the most exposed groups, like the elderly and children and college students, for example, health workers, who are much more likely to develop these post-traumatic stress disorders and anxiety, depression as well. And then we've got the other issue, more long-term, or possibly not more long-term, but also another issue which is emerging, a physical issue, which is long COVID. So certain victims of certain people who've suffered from COVID are still suffering the effects, despite the fact that they had the disease some time ago. So long COVID is symptomatic of people who have lost their sense of smell or their sense of taste when they had possibly COVID a year ago, or those who still feel chronically tired in the mornings, or others that have problems breathing. So this is going to be a major issue for our health services throughout the world in a long time to come. So if we look at communication, this is a vast area. So I'm going to try and narrow down the scope. I've only got 40 minutes before our question and answer session. I'm going to narrow it down to 3 different levels: the national level, the organizational level, and then the individual level. because at the end of the day, communication is a vast arena. It includes sharing information, ideas, emotions, and that's not just obviously verbally. 70% of communication is nonverbal, and that's very difficult when you're wearing a mask. It's very difficult when you can't show that you're smiling. It's your eyes that are smiling rather than your mouth. So I find teaching online is already difficult because you're only seeing my face. I can't pace as I can do in the classroom. I can't use normal gestures that I would like to apply during lectures. And of course, there's the added problem when actually dealing with hearing what students are trying to tell me when they're muffled with the mask, and then trying to decipher what I'm saying when they can't see my mouth working. And it means we have to devise ways of actually trying to improve on nonverbal communication to convey our message to you. So those are the three areas we're going to focus on: the national level, the organizational level, and the individual levels of communication. We're going to see what's happened during the pandemic and what steps we should take to improve every aspect of communications at these different tiers. As I said, this is a global crisis. I mean, to be honest, I thought there were only 193 countries that existed around the world. If you consult the number of UN members, United members of the United Nations, there are 193 nations. But in fact, there are 210 countries that have actually been affected by this pandemic. So what we've had is all sorts of reactions at a national level to the pandemic. We might have the United Nations. We might have our economic zones like the European Union, for example, but every country has reacted in a very different way. Possibly in the future, when we look post-pandemic, we need to do a lot more long-term planning and integrate as many countries, possibly through the UN more than any other consortium or organization, in order to make sure we can face up to this in a concerted and in a consistent manner, because the way governments have handled it has been really inconsistent and sometimes very short on efficacy. Let's just have a look. Often the message has not been clear. And what's happened with COVID, particularly with confinement, is many people having recourse to social media, and the conspiracy theories that have emerged from those dominant social media platforms has created conspiracy theories that have really impeded government efforts to wipe out this pandemic, and even led to violence. We've seen reports in Pakistan of attacks on health workers, and even people in Mexico wearing masks have been also attacked. So where there is a clear indication here where governments reacted quickly to the crisis, very quickly, where the communication was accurate and precise and factual, then this helped reduce the impact of the virus. However, in many cases, the communications coming out from governments was really inconsistent. And unfortunately, with what was evolving on social media in terms of conspiracy theories, with that combined with a real frustration with government and mistrust as well by society, this has led to a backlash in many countries. So, I was looking at the figures for Russia prior to this meeting last night, and Russia has hit its highest caseload. 40,000 cases, of which it's a terrible figure. 1,200 fatalities a day. That's what they hit yesterday. So, this is a massive surge. One of the problems is the government is trying to convey the message, but the populace don't trust the government. That's one issue. But there's also a great dependence in Russia on what is read on social media. So that combination has meant that only 33% of the Russian population have been inoculated. That's a disaster after so much time. It's a disaster when you consider the Russian government were one of the first to develop Sputnik, which has been proven to be an effective vaccine. So getting the communication wrong and allowing and not debunking social the misconceptions and the disinformation that's being shared on social media has been a real issue. Even Australia, if we look at Australia, Australia had a fantastic record on COVID. The government took rather drastic action. There were thousands of Australians that couldn't get back home. They just weren't allowed back into the country. And they spent nearly a year outside the country before they were allowed back in. Australia now has a problem. So although the Australian government communicated the issue very well, very quickly in the early days, and there was really good communication between the states and central government, they didn't actually introduce the vaccine until a few months ago. So again, there's an uptick in cases, there's an uptick in deaths, because governments haven't been consistent in treating this problem and in communicating the message early enough. The UK, how good has the government handled the crisis there? Well, they had daily broadcasts. Boris Johnson with his medical advisors next to him, and these were always very impressive sessions. But the introduction of the traffic light system of green, amber, red, of where you could travel and what you'd have to do when you return to the UK in terms of quarantine was an absolute disaster. So these lights would be switched off and on at any given time. So, for example, my daughter traveled to Malta. There was a green light to go to Malta, but then cases started emerging from Malta, in Malta, while she was there. And then within 5 days of her arrival, the UK government changed from green to amber, which meant she had to quarantine when she got back. So, this inconsistent approach in terms of communication has really lost the trust of many British citizens in the ability of government to communicate properly to begin with, and also to deal with this sort of crisis. What's quite interesting is what happened here in Switzerland. I'm talking to you from Montreux in Switzerland. Is that the canton? So we have various regions. We have 26 regional governments, if you like, and they're called cantons. And the cantons were given a little bit of free rein for the first couple of weeks. And then the federal government just said, enough's enough, we're just taking over. And that was the best thing that could have happened. And they really did nip it in the bud. Finally, just looking at how governments handle crisis communication and the pandemic itself, I think we've got to salute what happened in New Zealand and what happened in Germany, run by two women, two really excellent, one being the Chancellor, Angela Merkel, and the other being Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand, the Prime Minister. There have been virtually no cases in New Zealand, and very few cases in Germany, considering it's one of the largest nations in the well, it is the largest nation in the EU bloc. Why? Well, the communication was clear, it was prompt, it was factual, and it was believable and convincing. And that's the contrast. There is a contrast between those two countries and they're dealing with communication during the crisis, and the others I mentioned beforehand. So looking at the national level, what are the best practices? What should be done? What should have governments done to deal with such a global health emergency? Well, the first thing is transparency. Transparency and credibility, which often involves acting quickly and without consulting the public. We need to know, as the public, who had been consulted, of course, and what evidence was used to make decisions. But clarity and credibility goes right to the core of this issue, and also would help push back against the rumors being circulated, the disinformation being circulated on social platforms in the media. There needs to be clarity and consistency throughout all channels. That means being specific, whether it's traditional media or social media. What's interesting is that in most countries, the politicians, their popularity has waned considerably. Some have tried to make political capital out of what's gone on, but we generally have a trust in those who are communicating the true message, that we have trust in healthcare professionals, in scientists, and expert medical organizations, much more than we do in the politicians of any country, no matter how democratic it might be. So clarity is really important. Obviously, empathy, absolutely essential. I mean, that's a core part of leadership. Empathy is focusing, is part of altruism. True leadership is based on the needs of our citizens, of the people who are undergoing this disaster, and to be able to offer support, real support, that enhances credibility as well. And then combating misinformation. I've already touched upon that. What's the best way of doing this? Well, fact-checking. Fact-checking is really important. And that helps debunk any sorts of misinformation going on the internet. It's also important when politicians or when key members of government address these issues of disinformation on the internet, that they remind people to think about the credibility and about the accuracy of the information they're looking at online. Absolutely important. And that means looking at the credibility of the source as well before they start sharing it with other people. Building trust is important, as mistrust of governments at the moment and sometimes of health services. Mistrust is one of the drivers of these conspiracy beliefs. So these are all key. In my personal opinion, in terms of communication, I think countries' advertising could have been a lot more dramatic, a lot more radical in the effects of COVID-19. We'd seen news clips of those poor people suffering in hospital beds, but what should have been done were massive advertising campaigns by governments to really make it clear what the consequences are of contracting COVID-19. I mean, there's a whole myriad. We know the different ways it can be contracted, and we know that the long COVID can be extremely uncomfortable for over long periods of time, but also the ultimate results. What COVID-19 can lead to. And I thought you know, most countries I visited, there didn't seem to be this campaign initiated by governments to get the message across. You know, radical advertising, more needed on social networks by governments as well to get the message across and to try and debunk this misinformation that we've come across on the internet. So we've looked at the national level. What about the organizational level? You know, what's going to happen after COVID? What are the future market trends going to be, and how will they impact communication as a whole? Well, certain industries are beginning to recover, thank goodness. I think what's really important about the uptick is the importance of re-emphasizing the need to communicate with all stakeholders more efficiently than ever before. And I think many industries have learned that. They've had to resort to different means of communication online in order to reach their customers, to reach their suppliers, to reach out to their employees. So we're seeing certain industries on the road to recovery. What was amazing was how different sectors adapted. I mean, I mentioned before the hospitality industry and how seriously affected that was immediately. And certain figures I saw were just amazing. One hotel group managed to actually make a small profit on 10% occupancy. So 10% of their rooms, of their inventory in terms of rooms, had been filled, and they still managed to make a profit. It's never underestimate the genius of mankind and womankind, obviously. We've talked about obviously logistical problems that come with the road on the road to recovery, supply chain issues. What's interesting though is that in certain industries, you know, we've seen the boom in online platforms, possibly like the one we're using. We've seen these particular sectors booming. That's good to see. There have been, I think, over 1.5 million new business applications in the United States. That's almost double the figure for 2019. So there is an uptick, there is a surge in certain sectors, and I'm sure that will become more unified and more universal, let's say, across all sectors as we go into 2022. Certainly, there's been amazing and tremendous growth in the digitization side, meaning anything from online services, of course, to remote working, to reinventing supply chains as well, and also the use of AI, artificial intelligence. But still, we still need to look at the prime basics of communication, even using these new innovative approaches. So this involves listening, interacting, and personalizing. So we need to listen to what our customers want more so than ever before, and understand their needs, because their needs will be changing after COVID. If you take Google, I understand that a third of their workforce have been invited to work from home. So the needs of those workers might well change in connection with the sorts of things that they purchase, the suppliers of those employees' needs. So it's a question of listening to our customers' needs more closely than ever before, to be able to interact with them. Possibly there's less opportunity to do that face to face, to try and create a personalized service, which is so important. To use I mean, what we're seeing is smart technology that's also being used more and more frequently in order to build and maintain strong relationships with our customers. So chatbots we've come across, these are basically software tools to conduct online conversations, using text rather than speech, and influencer marketing as well. These are real growth areas. Moving on to the last area. This is the personal area. How much has communication changed for us personally? Well, I think we've all experienced this, every single one of us. Nobody's been left unaffected. I mean, the first one is social distancing. Here in Switzerland, we've been very fortunate. The rates are much lower than they have been over the last year, but still people are social distancing. People are still wearing masks, public transport, in shops. The message is still closely followed by the Swiss here. And yet I was in the UK a couple of weeks ago and I didn't see anybody with a mask. So, there are real contrasting approaches to this. The proof is in the pudding. There are the UK topped 50,000 cases this week. The Swiss, I think we got it down to about 910. I mean, we're a much smaller country, but at the end of the day, social distancing and wearing masks will not be a thing of the past for some time to come. We still need to take these precautions. So it obviously impedes our communication. I've mentioned facial features that can't be displayed. When was the last time I shook somebody's hands? I mean, here in the Francophone part of Switzerland, we shake hands, thoroughly, and we kiss the ladies 3 times. So, literally even more than the French do. So that's the normal welcome over here. That's gone. That sadly went out the window nearly 2 years ago. So handshakes replaced with a bow, maybe, or a head nod. A greeting or a hug with a wave, and that's really become the norm. Face masks, yes, we know that they hinder communication. And that many of us will be working remotely from home. I think that's actually been greeted by most employees with some glee. Working from home has all sorts of advantages, not just cost savings, but also the ability to try and find more of a work-life balance. It's difficult if you're in the office and you've got to pick up the children at 3:30 in the afternoon. They have to go into a nursery until you can collect them later. But if you're working from home, you have that flexibility possibly to pick them up. In terms of the ability to communicate better online, yeah, there are definitely ways we can do this. So, tips for online meetings. I was speaking to my communications class last night, and they're all business executives or business managers, and it was very interesting to see some of the ideas they came up with. I mean, one of the comments from one of my students was that there's far better planning for online meetings than there used to be on site. So people come prepared. She also mentioned the fact that there were far fewer interruptions, that meetings seemed to be a lot more productive than those that would possibly go over overrun on in the office, for example. So it's important to control the visual environment. It's important to be able to adapt one's nonverbal communication skills. I mean, the great thing is when we are talking like this, we don't need our masks, so at least we get our facial features back. Adjusting the pacing, what we're talking about there is what is the, how fast do we go through these meetings? What sort of rhythm do we use to, what structure do we apply in order to reach the end conclusion? It's very important to understand whose one audience is as well. You know, how do we pitch our presentation? How do we, where do we pitch it? Does the audience know more about this topic than we do? And also, it's very important to be able to practice and rehearse one's presentation as well. I think other features is it's important to ask participants to switch on their cameras. Otherwise, you know, you're losing that element of nonverbal communication, which is so critical. It also helps with understanding and clarity. We don't realize, but when we're listening to somebody, we're actually watching their lips as well, and that confirms in a latent manner what they're trying to say. It's also important to consider the diversity within meetings and also time zones. I mean, I think there's quite a big time zone between us, ladies and gentlemen, at the moment. I think we're 6 minutes past 5 here in the evening and early evening, and I think it's 10:05 where you are. So quite a difference there. So controlling the visual environment is key, and having those webcams on is also important. I mean, I had this parting comment, which, sorry, it should come up in a moment. Communication works for those who work at it. And I think this is true. What's very interesting, ladies and gentlemen, is the switch I made as a lecturer from being on site to online. And what amazed me was how everybody managed to switch our method of teaching so quickly, you know, literally on site on Friday, online on Monday, and yet it worked like magic. We can adapt so easily. So we need to work at communication. We can always develop our skills. We can develop new tools. But I don't think we should also forget traditional communication. The fact is that our face-to-face communication I don't think will ever be surpassed by online communication. When we meet in a face-to-face context, as I mentioned, 70% of our communication is nonverbal. So you'll be able to pick up on maybe the emotion behind what I'm saying rather than the content. And you'll probably listen more to the emotion than you will to the content. Or you can see by my gestures that I'm unhappy, although I'm possibly saying the opposite. So this is very much linked to something called contexting, where the nonverbal side, what's not said, is sometimes more important than what's said. So post-pandemic, is that going to change? And the answer is absolutely not. We're still going to need to meet on a regular basis to be able to develop relationships. So there's a closer rapprochement with our clients and our suppliers. We still need to meet to be able to truly understand what the other person is trying to say. So the traditional side of communication will never be replaced by the online version, this virtual version that we're enjoying today. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. I think we've got a little bit of time for questions and answers. So I'll stop sharing this, and then hopefully that will bring me back to where you are. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Reed, Professor Reed, for this hour, for these minutes full of knowledge, and for your insights on how the after-pandemic world will go. Unfortunately, we haven't had any more questions or any comments, but I don't know if you want to say something else or if that's it.
Well, I'm very. I mean, obviously, you might need a little bit more time, Maria, for our audience to ask any questions. But I mean, I could talk more about communication. I think it's such an interesting subject. You know, I like the sociolinguistic side as well. But I was in Italy recently. You know, I was talking about contexting, and the Italians are the most amazing, probably the highest context nation in the world. I was down close to Naples, beautiful place called Sorrento, which is close to Amalfi, south of Naples, and I was drinking a cup of coffee, just watching two Italians have a conversation, and the non-verbal aspect of what they were saying was tremendous. I mean, they have more gestures in south of Naples than any other place in the world, and it meant that neither party actually finished a sentence because they didn't need to. So you contrast that possibly with us in England, you know, where we're much more low context. We tend to use gestures far less. The content of what we say means probably a lot more than the way we say it. And that's a complete contrast, and that's just within Europe. So communications is a fascinating area. I think what we've learned and what's dawning on us all is that the way we convey our feelings is much more difficult online than it is when we meet face to face. But business can still work. You know, organizations are still flourishing, and they are adapting to what has been a very challenging area with COVID-19. Maria, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Professor, for that comment. I found it very interesting because here in Colombia, we also can be like that, like Italians in that way.
Yes.
Yeah, we don't always share stop with our comments. Like we
Yes.
always
Yes.
we don't always finish our sentences. Yeah, so I
Yeah. Lovely.
found that very interesting.
Yes, well, I'm looking forward, Maria, to actually witnessing that myself, and planning my trip to Colombia within the next couple of years. You know?
Yeah,
I've got to meet up.
hopefully you will be coming here soon.
Yeah, I hope so. So thank you very much.
Okay, Professor. So we thank our guest for his special participation and all attendees for joining us in this session of Cátedra Europa. We invite you to continue supporting the education of talented students through our scholarship fundraising campaign, Más Becas, by clicking on the donations button on the homepage of Cátedra Europa. We also encourage you to stay connected to the rest of Cátedra Europa's events. Thank you.